Good.
When Pam introduced me to the book that she's talked about, it was a revelation to me because of my personal history. And I would bring my mother into this because she was part of that world. She grew up as an Eastern European Jewish immigrant in New York in the 30s, and she was definitely a communist in the 30s, went to Brooklyn College and all that, but she was also into dance. And I never put it together. It just seemed like these two things about her that had nothing to do with each other that she did. And it was really looking at this book and understanding that in fact they were together. And some of the names that I saw in that book were the names of people who my mother danced with, Maria Marchovsky, and there were other names as well. And she also studied with Graham and so forth. But and my mom was 91, and she went and got herself a book immediately. I was very excited to have that validated. When I played that out to her, she said, of course they were connected. And it was just a dialogue we had never had before.
I was just wondering if the reason why Martha Graham was accepted is because she created a technique that was codified and a vocabulary that was codified and repeated. So then, people could become, I suppose, certified to teach her technique, which is a set, like class, that you build technique on. So do you think that had some, is that some reason why she was able to be acceptable? Because there was that instead of just the total freedom of expression on the inside.
Undoubtedly, and I think that's why too, her, because she had a technique, it was able to be passed on to other people, and so they could participate in it. Yeah.
But then it still went the way of ballet. I mean, it was a different technique, but it still had that was the vocabulary only.
It had a very strong stamp. Yeah.
Hence the postmodernists of the 60s
who rejected her,
who rejected.
Specifically modernism, and that's the reason. Just comment about.
I guess one last thing about Graham, which is that in her defense, although she didn't name things radically political names, and though she didn't, that wasn't the central place she was coming from. The images and the way that women and men were portrayed, and any number of other things about her dances and her power as a center of art too, was quite radical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and she did identify with oppressed individuals and groups in some of the dances that she did back then. The images were very much, I'm thinking of what we just saw, that this sense of this struggle, very much a Graham kind of image.
There's some debate too, because the majority of the dancers who danced for her were the revolutionary dancers, but who did what? Who knows? But they were all, it was a very sort of intermixed thing. So it's just a question about, where were those ideas coming from? And yeah, it's interesting, and I really want to know for sure. Dancers. Anybody else have any comments?
Yeah, I guess I find it interesting also the difference between the experience of dance as a performance that is seen and as something that is experienced, because for me there's a whole in my own personal history as a dancer, where I came from, I came out of my love for dance as a very young child came from a complete place of freedom, and then was channeled through a balletic system which has a lot of stricture and a lot of disconnection from self with the body, and my way, in a way, my personal political trajectory, and I'm talking about perhaps a different kind of politics than where I'd stand on the street with a sign, and more an internal revolution in terms of my relationship to being a living being. The next step for me was through something like the Graham technique. And although there is still a lot of stricture there, it was one step closer to, it's a doorway that opened for me where I am now, which is much more about, okay, how to exist as a compassionate, breathing, living, sensing being in the world, in the studio, and then outside of the studio. And I think there's something like, there's that other part of it that's not about the message behind a particular performance, but is the actual experiential engagement with the form, which to me is also political. Like, it's political on that cellular level, which facilitates any kind of thing you're going to say in the world afterwards.
It's like a way of living or something. How
Yeah.
you live your life
Yeah.
becomes what you're doing,
I mean-
and that's performance, and that's how you live outside of it.
Yeah, like, if I'm spending my time paying close attention to my breath, say, that's a very simple thing, and that's a very large part, say, of the Graham technique. I'm having to pay attention to how I'm actually feeling, and then I take that out into the world, and I can't ignore how it is that I'm feeling, and then it affects how I act as a human being with other people in the world on just a day-to-day level. So that's sort of what I'm
Well,
doing.
that becomes, in a way, to be revolutionary.
Yeah,
Like, because as soon as Martha Graham becomes codified, as Laura was saying, then it becomes a technique. And she didn't begin that way.
Mhm.
She began the way you're speaking about.
Mhm.
And then you end up saying, well, these are the circumstances now.
Yes,
We have to.
Yeah, and
Deal with it.
I think the thing is that, like, a technique, like anything, like, as soon as something becomes, like, it's strange that, that's one of the things that's so amazing about contact in terms of the way that it's passed on. Somehow it hasn't rigidified in that way, and so, like, when you encounter something like the Graham technique, you there's an opportunity there, which you could take or not, to, but somehow, like, the fact that it was codified allowed me to experience it, and then allowed me to go further with it.
Yeah, go
But-
through it almost.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
to me, it's still a doorway that was
Mhm.
offered.
Yeah, I just, sorry, add something else to say. But it's very interesting what you're talking about, because I went the same route from ballet to Graham and then onward. And it's an anatomical, or more than that, journey. If you think about ballet, the resistance to gravity, and if there's a center for the ballet body, it's fairly high, the high center. And for Graham, the center is core, right? And sexual. That's radical.
Which is
In
really
the
radical.
1920s, the 1930s, that's radical.
It's still radical.
It's I know, for women to be doing contractions and releases in public as dance, and then to go to contact improv, where it's not just identified as a center that is in yourself individually, but a shared center that you work with other person or people, it just seems like just that journey alone tells an enormous amount about the relationship in the human body to the idea of aesthetics and dance.